Washington is a city built on memory and on grudges. An ambassador leaves early, not because of a scandal, not because of failure, but because words spoken years ago suddenly matter again. Kevin Rudd was once Australia's Prime Minister, then its ambassador to the United States, and now, quietly, he is preparing to step away from Washington after a sharp, very public moment with President Donald Trump. On the surface, this looks routine. Diplomatic rotations happen. Statements are polite, praise is exchanged. But beneath that surface is something more revealing, a lesson about power, personality, and how modern diplomacy has changed. In today's world, old tweets never die. They wait, and when power shifts, they resurface. If you want to understand how personal politics now shapes global alliances, stay with me. This story matters more than it seems. Because to understand why this departure happened, we first need to understand what kind of diplomatic moment we are living in now. This is not just a story about one ambassador. It is about a shift in how diplomacy works when personalities dominate institutions. For decades, ambassadors operated in a buffered space. Private disagreements stayed private. Past opinions faded into archives. That buffer is gone. Kevin Rudd entered Washington with deep credentials. Former Prime Minister, seasoned China scholar, a figure respected across party lines, and by most accounts, he did his job well, working with both Democratic and Republican administrations, delivering outcomes for Australia, strengthening an alliance that has endured wars, crises, and leadership changes. Yet one thing followed him, not a policy failure, not a diplomatic breach, but comments he made years earlier, before he ever became ambassador. In the Trump era, politics is personal, memory is long, and power is direct. So the question is not whether Rudd was effective. The question is whether effectiveness still matters more than loyalty or perception of it. To answer that, we have to step back into history, back into how alliances survive political storms. To understand this moment, we need to understand where it comes from. The US-Australia alliance is not sentimental. It is strategic, built during World War II, reinforced through the Cold War, hardened by shared intelligence, military integration, and a common view of China's rise. Through all of that, one rule held firm. Personal politics stayed secondary. Ambassadors were not judged by what they once believed, but by what they delivered. They managed relationships, not emotions. They absorbed friction, so leaders did not have to. Kevin Rudd was shaped by that older system. A system where expertise mattered, where understanding China was an asset, not a suspicion, where alliances survived, leaders, elections, and insults, but history moves in cycles, and we are now in a different one. Populism has collapsed the distance between the personal and the political. Social media has collapsed time itself. A comment made in 2020 is no longer old. It is present, alive, and actionable, and that shift sets the stage for the first real rupture in this story. The moment came quietly, but its meaning was loud. October, a visit, cameras rolling. A reporter asks President Trump about comments Kevin Rudd once made. Comments from years earlier, before the ambassadorship, before this room. Trump pauses, then looks directly at the Australian Prime Minister and asks a question that lands like a warning shot. Is he still working for you? Rudd tries to explain. He stumbles. He clarifies. He reaches for context. Trump cuts him off. I don't like you either. I don't, and I probably never will. That sentence matters. Because in modern diplomacy, it is not just an insult. It is a signal that relationships now run through individuals, not offices. That history is not forgiven. It is remembered. If this kind of power shift concerns you, pay attention, because it is reshaping alliances everywhere. And what looks like a personal clash is actually something deeper. a system quietly rewriting its own rules. What sits beneath this moment is not anger, it is structure. Modern power no longer flows only through institutions. It flows through personality, through loyalty, through perception. In this system, diplomacy is no longer just about shared interests. It is about personal alignment. Kevin Rudd represented the old model. Expertise first, policy depth, long memory of history, but the Trump era operates differently. It rewards affirmation. It punishes dissent, especially dissent preserved online. Tweets become records. Opinions become liabilities. And apologies rarely erase first impressions. That is why Rudd's deleted posts mattered even after they were gone. Not because they shaped policy, but because they shaped trust. And in this system, trust is binary. You are either with or you are not. This is not unique to the United States. But America exports its political culture globally. And when the center shifts, everyone on the periphery feels it. Which brings us to the next escalation. Not in Washington, but in consequence. The escalation didn't arrive as a crisis headline. It arrived as a decision. An ambassador announces an early departure, carefully worded, respectful, grateful, officially nothing is wrong. Yet timing is never neutral in politics. This comes after the remarks, after the tension, after the quiet recalibration, and it coincides with Rudd's return to the Asia Society, an institution focused squarely on the question that now dominates global strategy, US-China relations. This is not retreat. It is repositioning, but it is also a signal. When friction emerges at the top, space below narrows fast. Diplomats adapt. They move sideways before they are pushed out. In the new order, survival often means preemptive exit. And that matters because it tells future ambassadors something crucial. Your past is not past. Your expertise does not shield you. And your margin for error is shrinking. Which raises the most important question yet. Who really absorbs the cost of this shift? Now let me bring this back to you. Because when diplomacy becomes personal at the top, the impact never stays there. You feel it downstream. You feel it when alliances feel less predictable, when long-term planning gives way to short-term signaling, when expertise is quietly sidelined because it carries history. For ordinary people, this doesn't look like geopolitics. It looks like uncertainty. Trade decisions feel sharper. Security guarantees feel less automatic. Global stability feels more fragile. You may never meet an ambassador, but your job, your economy, your region, all depend on whether powerful people can separate policy from ego. And when they can't, everyone pays a little more for that instability. If you've ever wondered why the world feels more tense, more brittle, this is part of the answer. If this analysis helps you see the system more clearly, take a moment to reflect on it. Because understanding power is the first step toward not being surprised by it. And from here, the story doesn't stay national. It goes global. What happens in Washington rarely stays in Washington. When a close US ally quietly adjusts its diplomacy, others notice. Not because of Australia alone, but because of what it signals about the center of power. Alliances are networks, and networks respond to cues. If ambassadors can be weakened by past speech, others become cautious. If expertise can be overshadowed by personality, strategy becomes thinner. In Asia, this matters deeply because the balance between the United States and China is already delicate. Kevin Rudd's next role focused squarely on US. China relations highlights the paradox. The world still needs deep understanding of China, but the political space for that understanding is narrowing. Partners in Europe, Asia, and beyond are watching closely. They are recalibrating how much autonomy their diplomats have, how visible their opinions should be, how carefully history must now be curated. This is how global behavior shifts, not through speeches, but through incentives. And once those incentives change, the future follows. So where does this lead? There are three possible paths ahead. The first is the optimistic one. Institutions adapt, personal politics cools, allies learn to navigate strong personalities without surrendering expertise. In this future, the lesson of Kevin Rudd's departure sharpens diplomacy rather than shrinking it. The second is the middle path. This becomes the new normal. Ambassadors self-censor. Governments choose safety over candor. Alliances still function, but with less depth, less honesty, less resilience. And then there is the worst case. Diplomacy hollowed out, policy replaced by loyalty tests, short-term alignment overriding long-term strategy, especially on China. History tells us systems rarely break all at once. They erode quietly through incentives that reward silence over insight. Which future emerges depends on whether governments remember why diplomacy exists in the first place. Not to flatter power, but to stabilize it. And that brings us to the final insight. Kevin Rudd's departure is not a scandal. It is a signal that diplomacy has entered an era where memory is permanent, power is personal, and expertise alone is no longer protection. Official statements will emphasize gratitude, and they should. By every public account, Rudd served effectively, but the deeper lesson is quieter and more unsettling. In a world where leaders speak directly, react instantly, and remember everything, the margin for independent thought shrinks. For allies, this creates a choice: adapt carefully or risk friction at the very top. For you, as a citizen of this global system, the takeaway is simple but sobering. Stability now depends less on rules and more on relationships. If you want to understand where the world is heading, don't just watch elections. Watch incentives. Watch who feels safe speaking and who quietly steps aside. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me, because the next story will ask an even bigger question. What happens when power no longer tolerates memory? That is where the future is being decided,